I always knew I wasn't supposed to be here. My parents made that clear enough. Growing up, I'd overhear things no kid should hear. Snippets of conversations about how they'd always dreamed of having a daughter, how the pregnancy was supposed to be the answer to their prayers. Then I came along. Not just me, though. My twin sister, Emily. She was the miracle they'd hoped for. I was the extra. It wasn't just words. It was in everything they did. Emily got the new clothes, the pretty dolls, the sparkly birthday parties. Me? I got hand-me-downs and lectures about being grateful for what I had. I wasn't even allowed to touch her toys because, according to my mom, boys ruin things. Emily loved reminding me of that. "Don't break it," she'd say with a smirk whenever I even looked at her stuff. Our room, if you could call it that, was the perfect metaphor for how things worked. Emily had the entire space, with her pink walls, shelves packed with her things, and a bed that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. My side was a mattress shoved into the closet. I didn't even have a proper pillow until I saved enough birthday money to buy one myself. The only person who seemed to care about me was my grandfather. He wasn't perfect, but he saw what was happening and tried to balance the scales when he could. He'd sneak me little gifts, books mostly, because he knew I loved to read. And he'd take me on walks where we'd talk about everything and nothing. When he died, I was 13, and it felt like the only person who gave a damn about me was gone. After that, things got worse. My dad started drinking more. My mom stopped pretending to care. And Emily, well, Emily flourished. She knew she was the golden child and leaned into it hard. She was always charming in front of others, but when we were alone, she was ruthless. If I complained, she'd roll her eyes and say, "Why don't you just leave if it's so bad?" When we were 16, Emily got pregnant. I wasn't surprised. She'd been sneaking around with her boyfriend, Jared, a 20-year-old dropout who spent most of his time drinking or smoking behind the gas station. My parents were furious at first, but that didn't last long. Within a week, they were planning a shotgun wedding and figuring out how to make room for Jared in our tiny house. That's when they decided I had to go. "We don't have enough space," my mom said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Jared needs a room, and Emily needs privacy. You're old enough to figure things out." I begged them to let me stay, even offered to sleep on the couch, but my dad just shook his head. "I sleep there when your mom's snoring gets bad," he said, like that was a valid excuse. I didn't have anywhere to go. Most of my friends lived in tiny apartments, and their parents weren't about to take in a kid whose own family had kicked him out. I spent a few nights sleeping on a park bench, trying to keep warm with nothing but my thin jacket. One night, a cop found me and dragged me back home. My parents put on a big show about how worried they'd been, telling the officer they had no idea I'd run away. The next day, my dad handed me a battered old tent he'd picked up from God knows where and told me to set it up in the backyard. "You can stay here," he said, "but don't expect any handouts." I wanted to argue, to scream at him, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. So I took the tent, set it up, and tried to make the best of it. That winter was one of the coldest I'd ever experienced. I remember one night. It got so bad I thought I might actually freeze to death. I knocked on the back door, desperate for warmth, but no one answered. I tried the window to their bedroom, hoping against hope that they'd let me in. My dad just yelled at me to stop being a nuisance and go back to my tent. I spent the rest of the night curled up in a ball, crying and wishing I could just disappear. The next morning, I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I had to find a way out. I packed what little I had and started walking, hoping I'd stumble onto something. Anything that could save me from the hell my life had become. I wandered for hours that day, walking through streets I didn't know, looking for help that wasn't coming. The few dollars I had in my pocket weren't going to last long, and the thought of another night in that freezing tent made my chest tighten. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a miracle, maybe just a sign that things could get better. By mid-afternoon, my stomach was growling, and I was starting to lose hope. That's when I stumbled upon a bakery with a "Help Wanted" sign taped to the window. It was a small, family-owned place with a faded awning and the smell of fresh bread wafting out the door. Desperate, I went inside and asked if they were still hiring. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Susan, looked me up and down like she could tell I was on my last legs. You ever work in a kitchen before? She asked. No, ma'am, I admitted, trying not to sound as hopeless as I felt. But I can learn. I'll do whatever you need. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me with a mix of skepticism and pity. Finally, she sighed. We need someone to help in the back, cleaning, stocking, that kind of thing. It's not much, but it comes with a place to stay. You'd be in the storage shed out back. It's rough, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. Interested? I almost broke down right there. Yes, ma'am, I said, my voice cracking. Thank you. The storage shed wasn't much. Just a small, dusty room piled high with sacks of flour and sugar. But compared to the tent, it felt like a palace. I spent my first night there cleaning it out, sweeping up the mess and setting up a little corner where I could sleep. There was no heat, but Susan let me borrow an old space heater from the bakery, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to warmth. The work was hard and thankless, but I threw myself into it. I swept floors, scrubbed pans, and hauled supplies without complaint. Susan didn't talk much, but her husband, Mike, would sometimes stop by and give me tips on how to do things faster or more efficiently. They weren't exactly warm people, but they were fair, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone saw me as more than just a burden. Over time, I started to learn more about how the bakery worked. I watched Susan bake, memorizing her movements, and asked questions when I thought she was in a good mood. Slowly, she started to let me help with the actual baking. Small tasks at first, like rolling dough or measuring ingredients, but it felt like progress. Every loaf of bread I helped make felt like proof that I wasn't useless, that I could do something right. I used what little money I earned to buy secondhand clothes and food, saving every penny I could. Nights in the shed were still lonely, and the cold crept in no matter how many blankets I piled on, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. One day, I'd have a real place of my own, a place no one could take from me. But even as I worked to rebuild my life, my family wasn't far from my mind. I didn't talk to them, I couldn't, but the memories lingered. I'd catch myself wondering if they even noticed I was gone, if they missed me, or if they were too busy doting on Emily and Jared to care. Part of me hated them, but another part, one I wasn't proud of, still wanted their approval. I wanted them to see that I wasn't the failure they'd always treated me as. By the time I turned 18, I'd saved enough to move out of the shed and into a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a single room with peeling wallpaper and a bathroom so small I could barely turn around in it. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had a place where I didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's rules. I still worked at the bakery, but I started picking up side gigs to make ends meet. I fixed bikes, painted fences, and even tried my hand at repairing cars. My dad had taught me a thing or two about engines when I was younger, and I found that I actually enjoyed working with my hands. It was satisfying in a way nothing else was, and it gave me an idea. Maybe I could turn this into something more. I started taking night classes at a local trade school, using every spare dollar I had to pay for tuition. It wasn't easy. There were nights I'd come home so tired I could barely keep my eyes open, but I pushed through. I told myself it would be worth it in the end, that every sacrifice I made now was a step closer to the life I wanted. And slowly, it started to pay off. By the time I was 24, I had a steady job at an auto repair shop, a better apartment, and a small but growing savings account. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of my life. The scars from my childhood were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. I was building something of my own, something no one could take away. I hadn't spoken to my family in years, and I told myself I didn't care if I ever saw them again. But deep down, a part of me still wondered if they ever thought about me, if they regretted what they'd done, or if they'd moved on without a second thought. I hadn't thought about my family for years, or at least that's what I told myself. The truth was, they were always somewhere in the back of my mind. A song on the radio, a passing comment from a coworker, even the smell of Emily's favorite perfume could send me spiraling into old memories I didn't want to revisit. But I'd gotten good at pushing those thoughts away. I had my own life now, one they had no part in, and I intended to keep it that way. By the time I was 28, things were finally starting to come together. I'd worked my way up to a management position at the auto shop and had a solid routine. My apartment, while still small, was clean, cozy, and entirely mine. I even managed to save enough to consider buying a house. It felt surreal, like I was stepping into a life I never thought I'd have. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A friend of mine, Ryan, was going through a messy divorce and needed to sell his house fast. It wasn't anything fancy, an older 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, but it was solid, and he was willing to sell it below market value just to get it off his hands. At first, I hesitated. Did I really need that much space? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was my chance to finally have something permanent, something I could call my own. So I took the plunge. The day I moved in was bittersweet. I stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes, and for the first time in years, I let myself think about what it had taken to get here. I thought about the tent in my parents' backyard, the nights spent shivering under layers of blankets, and the mornings where hunger was the only thing keeping me awake. And then I thought about now, about the house, the steady job, the life I'd built from nothing. I felt proud, but there was also a lingering sadness, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. I didn't tell anyone about the house, not even Ryan. I wanted to keep it to myself for a while, to enjoy the peace and quiet without anyone interfering. That didn't last long. 2 weeks after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I checked the peephole, half hoping it was a delivery or a neighbor introducing themselves. Instead, it was my parents. I froze. I hadn't seen them in over a decade, and there they were, standing on my porch like no time had passed. My mom had that same nervous smile she used to wear whenever she wanted something, and my dad looked as stern as ever, his arms crossed like he was already preparing for a fight. Behind them, I saw Emily, her husband Jared, and their kids milling around in my driveway. Emily was pregnant again. Of course she was. I debated not answering, but they'd already seen movement through the window. My mom started knocking harder. "Ethan, we know you're in there," she called, her voice bright and cheerful like this was a friendly visit. Reluctantly, I opened the door. They wasted no time pushing their way inside, my mom hugging me like we were long-lost friends while my dad gave a curt nod. "Nice place," he said, his tone loaded with something I couldn't quite place. Jealousy, maybe. "You've done well for yourself." I didn't respond, too stunned to say anything. Emily, meanwhile, wandered through the house, making herself at home. She peeked into rooms, running her hand along the walls like she was already imagining how she'd decorate. "This is perfect," she said, turning back to me with a wide grin. "The kids can have the smaller rooms, and Jared and I will take the master." I've always wanted a room with an ensuite. It hit me all at once. They weren't here to catch up or apologize. They were here to take. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Emily blinked, as if the answer was obvious. "We're moving in," she said. "Mom and Dad's house is too small, and with another baby on the way, we need more space. You're single, so it's not like you need all this room." I stared at her, then at my parents, waiting for one of them to step in and tell me this was all a misunderstanding. They didn't. Instead, my dad cleared his throat. "You're the man of the family now, Ethan. It's your responsibility to take care of your sister. She's got kids to think about." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "My responsibility?" I said, my voice rising. "You threw me out of the house at 16 so Emily could have her precious privacy. I lived in a tent. I worked in a bakery with rats crawling around me just to survive. And now you want to tell me it's my responsibility to take care of her? Are you kidding me?" My mom tried to calm me down, reaching out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "You're overreacting," she said. "We're family. Families help each other." "Really?" I said, laughing bitterly. "Where was that help when I needed it? Where were you when I was starving, freezing, begging for a place to stay? You didn't care about family then. Why should I care now?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Ethan. You're not still holding a grudge, are you? That was years ago. Besides, you've clearly done fine for yourself. You have a house now, a big one. It's time to let the past go." "Get out," I said, my voice steady but shaking with anger. They tried to argue, throwing out excuses and guilt trips, but I didn't budge. I stood by the door, holding it open until they finally realized I wasn't going to change my mind. My mom was crying by the time they left, and my dad muttered something under his breath about me being selfish. Emily, of course, had the last word. "You'll regret this," she said, glaring at me as she climbed into the car. "One day you'll need us, and we won't be there." I slammed the door and locked it, leaning against it as the weight of the encounter hit me. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, but underneath it all was a sense of relief. I'd stood my ground. For once, I hadn't let them take from me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. They'd be back. They always came back. I thought I'd made myself clear when I kicked them out, but I should have known better. A week later, my mom showed up at my house again. This time, she came alone, holding a plastic container of cookies like that was going to erase everything. She knocked softly, trying to appear harmless, but I could see her pacing nervously through the peephole. I debated ignoring her, but part of me knew she wouldn't leave until I let her in. When I opened the door, she gave me the kind of smile she always used when she wanted something. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, holding out the container. "I baked these for you. Thought you might like a treat." I didn't take the cookies. "What do you want?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Can't a mother just check on her son? You seemed so upset the other day. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." "I'm fine," I said. "You've checked. Now you can go." She hesitated, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Ethan, can we just talk for a minute? Please? I promise I'm not here to fight." I didn't trust her, but I stepped aside and let her in. She sat down at the kitchen table, setting the cookies in front of her like they were a peace offering. I stayed standing, arms crossed, waiting for the real reason she was here. "We've been struggling," she started, her voice soft and carefully measured. "Your dad's back has been acting up, and he's been missing work. And with Emily and the kids in the house, things are tight." "That's not my problem," I said, my tone flat. Her face twisted in frustration for just a second before she forced herself back into that concerned mother act. "I know you're still upset about the past," she said, "and you have every right to be. But we're family, Ethan. Families stick together, especially in hard times." I almost laughed. "You're really going to talk to me about family now? After you threw me out like garbage?" Her eyes filled with tears, the kind she could summon on command. "We made mistakes, I won't deny that. But we're trying to do better. And right now, we need your help." "There it is," I said, shaking my head. "What is it this time? Money? A place to stay? Let me guess. You want to move in here and give the house to Emily and Jared." She flinched, and that told me everything I needed to know. "It's not like that," she said quickly. "We just need a little stability. Your dad and I could help out around here. You work long hours. Wouldn't it be nice to have someone to cook and clean for you? And Emily said she'd even pay a little rent if you let her stay, too." That did it. "Get out," I said, my voice calm but ice cold. "Ethan, please," she begged, reaching out as if to grab my hand. But I stepped back. "No," I snapped. "I'm not letting any of you into my house. Not Emily, not Jared, not you, and definitely not Dad. I don't care what your excuses are. You made your choices. Now you can deal with the consequences." Her tears turned to anger in an instant. "How can you be so heartless?" she hissed. "We're your family. You wouldn't even have this house if it weren't for us." That set me off. "If it weren't for you?" I said, my voice rising. "You mean if it weren't for you throwing me out at 16? If it weren't for you ignoring me while I lived in a shed and worked myself to the bone just to survive? You don't get to take credit for anything I've built. I did this. Me. And I don't owe you a damn thing." She sat there, stunned into silence for a moment. Then she grabbed the container of cookies and stood up. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "One day, you'll realize how much we've done for you." I opened the door and gestured for her to leave. "Don't come back," I said. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I locked it and leaned against it, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was exhausted. I knew she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 days later, I got a call from my neighbor, Mr. Hargrove. He was an older man who spent most of his time sitting on his front porch, watching the neighborhood like a hawk. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and serious. "I saw your sister and her husband around your house today. They were peeking in the windows and walking around the backyard. Looked like they were up to no good." My stomach dropped. "Did they try to break in?" I asked. "Not that I saw," he said, "but it seemed like they were planning something. I thought you should know." "Thanks, Mr. Hargrove," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I'll take care of it." As soon as I hung up, I went to the hardware store and bought security cameras. I spent the rest of the day installing them around the house, double-checking every lock and window. I didn't trust Emily or Jared to stay away, not after what Mr. Hargrove had told me. Sure enough, 2 nights later, the cameras caught them trying to break in. Jared was fiddling with the lock on the back door while Emily stood watch, her youngest kid clinging to her leg. I called the police immediately, watching from my phone as the cops arrived and caught them in the act. They were arrested on the spot, and their kids were taken into protective custody. It should have been a victory, but all I felt was anger. Anger that they'd pushed me to this point. Anger that they couldn't just leave me alone. The next day, my parents called me, furious. "How could you do this to your sister?" my mom yelled. "She's a mother. What about her children? What about me?" I shot back. "You've spent my entire life putting her above me. Not anymore. I'm done. Don't call me again." I hung up and blocked their numbers, feeling a weight lift off my chest. For the first time, I realized I didn't need their approval. I didn't need them at all. The days following Emily and Jared's arrest were eerily quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, my phone wasn't blowing up with guilt-tripping calls or messages, and there were no unexpected knocks on my door. I knew better than to think it was over, though. My family had a way of bouncing back from rejection like cockroaches after the lights came on. They didn't give up, they just regrouped and tried another angle. Sure enough, about a week later, my parents showed up again. This time, they came together, standing side by side on my porch like a united front. My dad had his arms crossed, his expression a mix of frustration and what I could only describe as forced humility. My mom looked exhausted, like she'd spent the entire week crying and was ready to weaponize every tear against me. I didn't want to let them in, but I also didn't want to deal with the scene they'd undoubtedly cause in front of my neighbors. So I opened the door. "We're not here to argue," my dad said immediately, holding up his hands like he was surrendering. "We just want to talk." I didn't move from the doorway. What could you possibly have to say that I haven't already heard? My mom sniffled, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she must have been clutching for dramatic effect. "Ethan, we're at the end of our rope," she said, her voice cracking. "We don't have anywhere else to go." I rolled my eyes. "You have a house, don't you? Or did you give that up to Emily, too?" That hit a nerve. My dad's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to snap back at me. Instead, he sighed heavily and said, "Yes, we gave the house to Emily, but we didn't have a choice. She has kids. They needed the space more than we did." "And now what?" I said, crossing my arms. "You want me to give you my house so you can keep enabling her? Not happening." "No one's asking you to give up your house," my mom said quickly. "We just need a place to stay. We wouldn't be a burden, I promise. We could help out with the mortgage, with bills." I laughed bitterly. "Help out? With what money? Dad can barely work, and you've spent every dime you've ever had on Emily and her circus. Let's be real. You want me to take care of you because you can't take care of yourselves anymore. Just admit it." My mom burst into tears, and my dad's face turned red with anger. "You don't have to be so cruel about it," he said. "We're your parents. We've done everything we could for you, and this is how you repay us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Everything you could for me?" I said, my voice rising. "You mean throwing me out of the house when I was 16? Making me live in a tent while Emily got everything handed to her? Letting me starve and freeze while you played happy family with her and Jared? If that's your idea of everything, then no, I don't owe you a damn thing." My dad opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "You made your choice," I said firmly. "You put Emily and her family above me at every turn. You're still doing it. And now that it's blown up in your face, you want me to pick up the pieces? No. I'm done. You're not moving in here. End of discussion. They stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. My mom looked like she wanted to say something, but my dad grabbed her arm and shook his head. Let's go, he muttered, turning toward the door. As they walked out, he threw one last parting shot over his shoulder. You'll regret this, Ethan. One day, you'll realize what you've lost. I slammed the door behind them and locked it, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and relief. I knew they'd be back. They always came back, but for now, I was glad to have the house to myself again. A few days later, Mr. Hargrove, my neighbor, stopped by. He didn't say much, just handed me a cup of coffee and sat down on the porch with me. After a long silence, he finally spoke. You know, I've been watching how your family's treated you over the years, he said. And I just want you to know, you don't owe them a damn thing. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without getting emotional. Mr. Hargrove wasn't the kind of man to offer advice unless he really meant it, and hearing those words from him felt like validation in a way I didn't even realize I needed. That night, I sat in my living room, looking around at the house I'd worked so hard to buy. It wasn't much, just a modest place with old floors and a creaky staircase, but it was mine. Every inch of it was a reminder of how far I'd come, of everything I'd survived. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. I didn't hear from my parents or Emily for a while after that last encounter. The silence was unnerving at first, but I slowly began to settle into it, enjoying the calm. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was truly my own. No demands, no guilt trips, just peace. Then, one afternoon, I got a notification from my security cameras. Checking the footage, I saw Emily and Jared on my property again, this time with their oldest kid. They were peering into windows, pointing at things like they were making plans. My blood boiled, but I didn't panic. I called the police immediately. By the time I arrived home, the officers were already there, questioning them. Emily was crying, claiming they were just visiting. But the officers weren't buying it. The restraining order I'd filed weeks ago made it clear they had no right to be there. They were arrested for trespassing, and this time, I pressed charges without hesitation. That was the last straw. After they were taken away, I contacted a lawyer to make sure my house was legally protected from any future claims. I installed even more cameras, locked down my finances, and changed the locks again for good measure. Since that day, they've stayed out of my life. I haven't seen or heard from my parents, Emily, or anyone else from that toxic part of my past, and I don't miss them. I've built a life without their chaos, their manipulation, and their endless demands. My house is quiet now, and for the first time, that silence feels like freedom. I'm finally free, and I'll never let them take that away from me.